back. So we are going to get started now on the first session of the afternoon. The presenter is going to be Eric Hilt, who's a professor of economics at Wellesley College and a specialist in American economic history. And he is going to speak on his paper, The Ownership and Control of American Public Corporations, 1880 to 1920. He has co-authors on this paper, Carola Friedman and Lauren Mostrom. Okay, Eric.
Thank you very much, Naomi and Henry, for including us in this wonderful conference. This is brand new work, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to get everybody's feedback about it. So as everybody here, I assume, knows, Burley and Means famously argued that by 1930, many large American corporations were so diffusely held that their stockholders no longer played any role in their governance, and in fact, managers were in control. So the ideas of that book spurred a gigantic and contentious literature. Not everything in the book is generally accepted, but it is commonly argued that the separation of ownership from control is a defining characteristic of mid-20th century American corporations. And we want to contribute to the literature on this topic and to our understanding of it by studying the evolution of public companies in the years leading up to 1930 to investigate the institutional forces that might have enabled the separation of ownership from control to have occurred. What might these institutional foundations or forces have been? There's been a number of different and very interesting ideas advanced. There's the law and finance view that strong investor protections are what enables a separation of ownership from control to occur. Other scholarship has contradicted that view and argued that other areas of the law are more important than securities law or investor protections, and has also highlighted the role for political economy forces in shaping the distribution of ownership. In this paper, we make a contribution that's related to those, in that we're going to argue that antitrust enforcement was very important for shaping the distribution of ownership, at least of railroads. Before getting into the details, I need to discuss for a moment what we mean by control of a corporation. So Burley and Means and most of the literature focus exclusively on voting rights. And so to them, if there's no majority owner or there's no, or large owner, or there's no legal device putting some minority order in control, then the enterprise is controlled by management, it just reverts to management. The limitation of that view is that at least in some circumstances, there might be other actors who wield some influence within a corporation, and it's important to acknowledge that. So the economist Douglas North wrote this very interesting essay on the literature on corporations in 1950, and he said, you know, if you're focusing only on the distribution of ownership and this question of the separation of ownership from control from that limited perspective, what you're doing is you're assuming away the significance of all the other structural changes and external pressures that coexist to shape the institution. And what he had in mind was forces like the state, or labor unions potentially, or other actors like that. Creditors certainly come to mind. But another important example for the very early 20th century is elite financiers. So extraordinarily powerful actors, these guys were in the early 20th century, highlighted by Brandeis and by the Pujo Committee's investigation. And they may have held significant influence among public companies, particularly those where they held directorships, even if they were not major owners. Okay, so if they were powerful forces in corporate governance, looking at the distribution of ownership alone will not necessarily reflect, you know, who's powerful or who's in control of that corporation. So in our paper, we document the presence of elite financiers on corporate boards, and we discuss examples where they wielded significant power. So very quickly, one last mention before we get into the details. There is a very interesting literature on corporate ownership in the early 20th century, including by people who I know are here today. most of these works focus on extremely limited numbers of companies, right? And the lack of available data has hampered the analysis and made this literature a little bit more contentious than I think it ought to be. So one of our contributions in this paper is to introduce a lot of new data, including data that has not been utilized previously in scholarship on the subject, to try to help resolve some of these disputes. So what do we do in this paper? What we do is we study the ownership of all New York Stock Exchange listed corporations from 1880 to 1920, so the 40-year period spanning the turn of the 20th century, at 5-year intervals. And the data we collect are, first of all, data on the total number of shareholders. And we get this from a very large array of sources. And we have pretty decent coverage with this, particularly in the later years of the sample. We have comprehensive data, so almost all of them, on their boards of directors, so who is on their board. And we match those lists of directors to lists of the top underwriters to see where elite investment bankers are present in boards of directors. And then lastly, for the railroads, from ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission data, we have the identities of their largest owners in 1908 and 1918. So this is the detailed ownership that one would really love to have for all corporations. It's okay in a way that we only have it for railroads because those were the most important public companies, at least at the beginning of our sample period. So here's some basic descriptive data of our sample. The top panel is counts of NYSE listed companies. The blue are railroads, the red are the other ones, which are mainly industrials and utilities. The railroads go through somewhat of a boom in the 1880s and then sort of stabilize at about, between 75 and 100 publicly listed companies in the later period. The industrials in particular are growing almost continuously through this period, so that by 1920, there's almost 350 publicly listed industrials. So the market becomes dominated by those firms at the end, whereas it was dominated by railroads at the beginning. In terms of the size of the firms, it's very interesting. The railroads grow continuously beginning about 1890 and to become quite large. So I'm showing the median median total assets. So it grows from about 35 million to about 150 million. With the industrials and utilities, they stay the same. So median total assets remains at about 33, 35 billion throughout the entire period. And that's because, it's not because the industrials are not growing, it's because there are these new cohorts coming in who begin very small and keep the median relatively low. Okay, so let's look at our ownership data now. Begins a little bit later for the industrials, which are in the bottom panel. Okay, whereas for our railroads, we have them pretty continuously from 1880 to 1920. So several things to note here. Let's focus on the railroads at the top first. First of all, these numbers are not that high, right? So this is median total owners for NYSE listed railroads. And it starts in 1880 at about 1,000. And in 1920, it's about 2,500, right? So these are not huge numbers. Burleigh means, and many other sources on early 20th century corporations frequently quote the widely publicized total owners numbers for really big corporations like AT&T and US Steel and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which by 1920 had more than 100,000 shareholders, and by the 1930s in some cases had like 500,000 shareholders. So what this shows is that those numbers are very unrepresentative, that those corporations are outliers. Corporate ownership is becoming more diffuse. The number of owners is growing significantly, but not that rapidly. Another thing to note about the railroads is, although it's increasing from 1880 to 1895, it falls after 1895, right? And this is not caused by a new cohort of railroads entering with smaller numbers of owners. This is ownership, total ownership of the publicly traded railroads contracting, okay? And it contracts and remains contracted through about 1905 and then expands again. So this is not a simple process of continuous growth. We shouldn't think of this as, markets are deepening, shareholding is becoming more widespread, and you have this natural growth. There are forces acting on this process that cause it to go up and to go down over time, which will become the focus of our analysis. The lower panel, industrials and utilities, it starts a little bit later. We struggle to find good data from before 1900. We have some, but it's probably not representative. That really increases between 1913 and 1920. It has a lot to do with things like employee ownership plans. The utilities have like customer ownership plans and so on, and also much broader interest in investing in the years after World War I. Okay, let's look at our data on the presence of elite financiers on corporate boards. So with railroads, that's the dark blue line at the top. It starts at about 15% and rises to 60%. And if you look at the largest railroads, that's the dashed line, gets as high as 100% and then drops off. With industrials and utilities, it's a lot lower. Okay, so when you're thinking about, you know, the money trust and powerful bankers being on corporate boards, you're really thinking about railroads and large firms, and somewhat less about industrials and utilities. Okay, the process that we think is driving patterns of control in railroads, and we're going to switch to railroads now, is a reflection of antitrust enforcement. Okay, so the fundamental problem in railroads is always rate wars and price cutting in response to the fact that they have low variable costs and high fixed costs. The solution that's adopted universally in the industry is pooling agreements, also cartels. So these pools become the subject of antitrust investigations at the state level and the federal level. The big change, and this is what I call antitrust development 1 in our chronology, is that they get held to be in violation of the Sherman Act by the Supreme Court in 2 very famous cases, Trans-Missouri Joint Traffic Association. So the industry responds to this by the ruling that their pools are illegal by creating what are called communities of interest. Okay? And communities of interest are systems, and they're generally facilitated by bankers, in which railroads invest in their competitors' stock. So they hold blocks of stock in their competitors, usually not controlling blocks, so minority stakes, although sometimes they are majority stakes. Okay, now that system of communities of interest itself provoked antitrust investigations and a lot of public outrage. And the next antitrust development is that the Supreme Court held that those were illegal. And the 1904 Northern Securities case held that a merger of competitors was illegal. 1912 decision of the Union Pacific case held that a large ownership stake in a competitor violated the Sherman Act as well. So the industry's response to that, beginning especially in 1913, was to divest those community of interest stakes. So again, returning to ownership patterns of railroads, this decline in numbers of owners was partly a reflection of the fact that ownership was becoming more concentrated as railroads invested in each other. And this increase, especially after 1910, was partly a reflection of the fact that the railroads were divesting themselves of their stakes in their competitors. If we look at the largest owners of railroads, so here's that ownership data from 1908 I mentioned. Ownership is very concentrated, so the largest 10 owners own about half the shares. The largest category of owners is other railroads, owning 23.2%, and investment bankers own relatively little. So the investment bankers on the boards of these railroads own only 2.3% on average. So if investment bankers are in control, it's not through ownership. Okay, I'm going to very quickly, if I have time, talk about some anecdotal data at Henry's request. I have one. Okay, so right. So what I'm showing you here is just a brief synopsis of some anecdotal data. These in the box in the center are the coal railroads that supplied coal to East Coast cities. What the arrows show are extensive investments in one another, with the percentages owned attached to it. If we look at this again around 1918, after the Supreme Court held that these investments among competitors was illegal, you see that those are mostly gone, and the investments that remain there are like vertical connections among different railroads. The overall distribution of ownership in 1918 was still concentrated. So the largest 20 owners, which is what we have at that time, owned 41% of the shares. But the shares held by other railroads had been cut almost by half to 13%. Right? So the railroads divested themselves of their stakes in their competitors, and that produced a much wider distribution of ownership. So among the more significant divestments were 4 railroads, which are depicted as a dashed line in this picture. They were divested after the Supreme Court's 1912 Union Pacific decision. We study their total owners over time and compare them to the total owners of a comparable set of railroads, comparable only in the sense of having had a similar number of owners early in the period. And you can really see this divergence. So you see the effect of these divestments on total owners. So the fact that railroads were no longer investing in one another to this extent contributed to the diffusion of ownership. So just very quickly, some conclusions, I'll wrap up. Over our sample period, public companies did experience growth in their number of shareholders, but it was not as rapid as commonly cited, and it was not a simple linear process. And antitrust enforcement shaped it in many ways, in some cases causing it to be more concentrated, and in other cases to be less concentrated. Didn't have that much time to feature this, but the role of elite financiers in corporate management at this time was also likely significant, which is not to say that they were necessarily fully in control of these enterprises, but they were certainly influential. Ownership lists alone may not fully capture all the sources of power within corporations. And it's worth noting that the distribution of ownership itself was controlled by elite financiers in the sense that they were arranging for competitors to invest in one another and therefore change the composition and the number of owners. On the other hand, a lot of contemporary sources assume that when you see a JP Morgan partner on the board of a railroad, that JP Morgan controls that railroad. I think that probably exaggerated the extent of their influence, which I think varied depending on a lot of different circumstances across railroads.
So we have already quite a few people on the queue. So it's Brian Sheffin, Stan Rath, Marco Becht, Les Hanna, and Richard Squires.
Yeah, that was a great paper, Eric. So 2 points. One I've already raised with Eric, which is something that may not be clear in terms of what was happening with the railroads buying stakes in other railroads. What you were actually seeing before the Northern Securities case was very early versions of hostile takeovers. They were going onto the stock market and they were buying up majority stakes using the stock market. And then the way I think you could look at Northern Securities, which was exactly that, was that when Northern Securities came down, that they then went to smaller stakes and then they had to ratchet that further down. The other point, and that won't come as a surprise to Eric because I corresponded with him about it. The other point, and this is, so if you look at the title of the paper and the abstract of the paper, the impression is created that what we're going to get is a paper about ownership and control in US companies in the round. And what we actually have is the front end, yes, but like for more than half the paper, what we have is a very good paper on railway ownership. Which is great, and the fact that they were huge companies makes these very salient. But of course, everyone knows the punchline, which is railways are on the way out. They're not going to shape the American economy as it develops through the 20th century. And is it actually the case? And I'm assuming that you and your co-authors worked diligently to find information on industrials and utilities up to 1930. Can we infer that it may in fact be impossible to find actual detailed granular ownership data on these kind of firms? Thanks.
Okay, so with regard to the first question, there's no doubt that communities of interest were not always friendly, and that in some cases it's a dominant competitor investing in a smaller regional competitor to gain influence with it, sometimes on a hostile basis. So I don't mean to imply that this is always an amicable relationship. So with regard to the ownership of the industrials and utilities, the problem, the reason that we have good data for the railroads is that the Interstate Commerce Commission required them to produce that data. And to my knowledge, there were a number of different studies of corporate ownership of all public companies. They tended not to ask the identities of the largest owners comprehensively. And corporations were not legally obligated to share that information. And sometimes when they were asked to, they resisted. So we're looking hard. I don't want to say the data will never be uncovered and doesn't exist, but it's much more challenging to find the identities of the owners of firms other than railroads for that reason. And that's why the TNEC investigation and the disclosures created by the creation of the Securities Exchange Commission were so significant, because it created sort of broad access to data, and that's why the literature usually starts with that. But thank you for those comments.
Yeah, thanks very much, Eric.
Dan.
Okay, I want to ask a question about the middle claim on the conclusions 2 slide. It's really a qualification about how ownership lists may not fully capture sources of power within the corporation. I presume that most of the really salient decisions were made in board meetings rather than in democratic assemblages of the ownership body of the company. And I'm very interested in the question of the composition of boards of directors in the 20s and 30s, and in particular, the extent to which, first of all, heads of companies are chairs of the board, and secondly, to the extent to which there are inside directors. Does your collection of information in your terminal year of 1920, does that give you any scope to understand anything, for instance, about the incidence of inside directors?
So thank you for that. It turns out we have, my co-authors and I have another paper where we're focusing on exactly this question. So the evolution of the composition of corporate boards. So I'll just give you a highlight of that, but I really want to defer to the other paper. So, the boards were very stable, tended to have 12 members. There tended to be about 2 or 3 insiders in the sense of current executives on the board. So among the outside directors were often 2 or 3 elite financiers, and then a range of others. So we can't really measure insiders in the way that insiders are designated in modern data as having some kind of business relationship with a firm and so on, but we can see who the current executives are. And so in any case, if you look at 1920, you're gonna see, on average 1.5 or just over 1 elite financier, a couple of current executives, and the rest, well-known people from the industry and so on.
Thank you.
So Marco's next, and then after Marco, we have Les, Richard, and Yasha.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Brian's comment. So first of all, that it's a great paper. And then secondly, to just, well, first of all, thank you for kindly citing the work with Brad DeLong. That's very kind. Now, I just want to mark there that I think the conclusion, the overall conclusion that it was antitrust for everybody might be incorrect. I think you showed that it's true for railways, but that has to do with the way that the horizontal combinations were done in the case of railways. In the case of the industrials, what Brad and I showed was that if you take the widely held in the TNEC and you match that up with the list of Moody's trusts, there's an almost 1-to-1 match. And the reason is that Naomi showed this in her work. The horizontal mergers were done by buying up the different companies and then putting the combined entity onto the market with a lot of security issuance. Now, that's the mechanism, and that would explain why they're so widely held when you get to the TNEC. However, what we don't have, and there Brian already asked my question, is of course, we don't know the ownership structure of US Steel after the IPO. So let me repeat Brian's question. Is there any hope based on the amazing digging you've done, that we'll ever find the ownership structure of US Steel after the IPO to show that Brad and my conjecture were correct.
So thank you for that. Your point is very interesting, and it suggests in a way that it actually is the case that antitrust enforcement also shaped the distribution of ownership of the industrials, but in a different way, right? So whereas, with railroads, you have these widely held enterprises that are colluding, and then, they're prohibited from colluding, and so they start to integrate with one another, and then the integration is prohibited, so they become widely held again. With industrials, earlier on, you have this amalgamation of the trusts, right? That apparently gets a pass, at least in the early years, from an antitrust standpoint. And so you have these very large amalgamations forming, as Naomi shows in her work on the Great Merger Movement, right? So the fact that they were enabled to do that unconstrained, at least initially, by antitrust law, probably contributed to diffuse ownership in that industry. So you're shaking your head, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Michael,
you don't
go
need.
ahead and follow
Yeah,
up.
you don't need antitrust for this to work, because all you need is the promoter buying up the family-owned companies. JP Morgan buys out Carnegie, which was a private company, and then he puts the whole lot on the market. If antitrust had stopped him from doing that, you wouldn't have seen the widely held. Where you do have a point is that when the anti-money trust came in, maybe JP Morgan was under the delusion or illusion that they could keep control by having people on the board. And then the money trust got rid of the people on the board, and you then have, instead of the financial capitalist or corporation, you have the managerial corporation arise, because antitrust got rid of the people on the board. But I don't think that the ownership dispersion needs antitrust in the industrials with the horizontal combination.
Okay, so we'll let you people continue that later if you want. But now let's go on to Les.
Eric, again, let me say with everyone else that was a great paper, but it was Hamlet without the prince. I mean, you're a brand name, the Hilt Index, and you didn't mention it. And yet earlier papers did. We heard all about democratic shareholding in Egypt and Russia and all the protections for small shareholders. And yet, when we come to the United States, we hear about plutocratic autocrats, or at least, those figures that you showed seem to suggest that insofar as numbers of shareholders increased, it was just a sop with, AT&T giving it to their consumers and a few railroads giving it to their employees. But basically, Harriman and Gold own them. So there's a question. Why didn't Harriman and Gold understand the advantages of giving small shareholders power? You'll recognize that that's a bit tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's a frustrating element of working in this later period relative to the early 19th century. It's difficult to get access to these corporations' charters and bylaws. Right? They're held in
we know nothing about them in America.
The state of Delaware's.
More in Russia and Egypt.
Right, exactly. The state of Delaware's Secretary of State's office has microfilmed them all. It's a really difficult process to get access to them one at a time. It's just very, very hard. So yes, I would love to know more about the role, if any, that protections along those lines written into these charters played or not. But it does seem like, as you move forward in time, what's more significant potentially is, state level prohibitions against mergers of competing railroads and other kinds of factors that were not relevant in the early 19th century start to become important as well. Now, I think it's interesting at the time when the railroads were investing in one another, there was a lot of public discussion of it, and Harriman himself, E.H. Harriman, the sort of railroad entrepreneur, was asked to comment on it in the Wall Street Journal. And what he said was that he was unhappy with it. Like he wanted to have diffuse ownership, ordinary households owning the bulk of the shares, but that antitrust laws made it impossible. So his response, and obviously this is a political and politically motivated argument, was that, you know, because he wasn't allowed to collude with his competitors, he needed to take control of his competitors, or at least get influence on their boards of directors, and that meant buying stakes in them, and that meant no longer having small investors in such large numbers. So that argument was explicitly made at the time.
Richard.
Thank you. I also enjoyed this paper very much. I like this period of American history, economic history, between the antitrust laws and the creation of the Federal Reserve and the creation of the federal income tax, all at about the same time or close to each other. It was basically the time where the federal government took over the economy. So not surprising that you're seeing an effect here as well. My question is about the metric that you're using for the Burley means kind of question, which is, do we have a separation of ownership and control? You know, is ownership in the market? Of course, a firm could have a controlling shareholder and also have 10,000 other shareholders, right? So I was wondering if you also thought you would could look at something like percentage of shares owned by like the top five shareholders, the shareholders with the largest shares, and you add those up. I don't know what the best metric is for testing for the presence of a control block. But I would wonder if you're already looking at firms that even if we double the number of shareholders, we're already well beyond any kind of threshold where you would have any possibility of control by the shareholders. So you're asymptotic already at the level of control fully in the market. And so if you looked at concentrations instead, you could get a better sense of the specific thing I think you're concerned with, or at least the way you teed it up.
So it's a great point. So we have, you know, this percentage owned by the largest shareholders for the railroads, and so when we have it, we use it. But a much more broadly available piece of data that Burley means emphasize is like total shareholders, and it's a little bit ambiguous how much that matters. You know, if you have a 10% owner, does it make a difference if there's 100 other shareholders, or 1,000, or 10,000, or 100,000? You know, it may at the margin, in the sense that, you know, someone who's trying to build a coalition to oppose that 10% owner is going to go through a lot more expense and difficulty in trying to assemble, you know, a large percentage of the shares if they have to communicate with 100,000 people instead of 1,000 people or something like this. This is also relevant, by the way, to the early history of the corporation. So in the early 19th century, in many US states, you know, there were corporations with hundreds of owners, right? 300, 400. And the question is that a separation of ownership from control or not when there's a few minority shareholders? So it's difficult. The reason we can actually measure the total number of owners over time is that it was so politically salient. So state governments required, in some cases, corporations to report that number, whereas they did not require them to report you know, the identities of their largest owners in most cases. And so we can see it over time, we can see it growing, and we can compare it to what Burley and Means show. But you are exactly correct that it doesn't directly relate to who's in control of a corporation. So it's the second best that we can come up with.
So we have, right now on the queue, the next person is Yeshe and then Bill English.
Let me ask two things. One is related to Marco's question. I wasn't quite clear on the mechanism by which antitrust is related to dispersed ownership, and whether this is a general thing or just a railroad thing. And the second half of this is, we know that in America there was concentrated ownership 20 years after this period. So to the extent that this mechanism pushed towards dispersed ownership, it was sort of limited.
So the first question is antitrust, a railroad-only phenomenon. You know, to the extent that antitrust can reshape the industrial organization of an industry, it can potentially always influence the distribution of ownership indirectly. So, you know, if an entire industry is going to is permitted to consolidate into a single firm, that firm's ownership will probably look different than if it's not permitted to consolidate in that way, and instead you have 50 smaller firms or something like that. So it's I think the relationship is potentially general, but having said that, like the very close connection that we find is only in railroads here, because that's where you see these very radical changes in response to antitrust. The other thing I would mention with regard to projecting forward and so on is that the relationship between, antitrust and the degree of concentration in corporate ownership or not is not always straightforward. So in response to a shift in more rigorous enforcement of antitrust, if you want to think of it that way, in the sense that cartels among railroads was prohibited, you got more concentrated ownership in the sense that railroads responded by investing in one another. And then when that response was prohibited, you got more diffuse ownership. Okay, and so that it's not necessarily straightforward. That stronger antitrust can potentially produce more concentrated ownership as well as more diffuse ownership, depending on what's being responded to and so on. But thank you for that question.
Thanks. I thought this was a really interesting paper. I'm gonna show, I think, some of my ignorance about this set of issues in this period. But I was struck in your Pennsylvania anthracite coal example by even after the big change in ownership, you still have George F. Baker on a lot of these boards. And what are the rules for overlapping boards at this point? I mean, there are different ways of asserting control. As somebody said earlier, a lot of these decisions are made by boards. So that seems like a really important issue. And I just don't know what that looked like at the time.
It's a very important issue. And so in the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, there's a provision that held that securities underwriters, that is, financiers who are actively involved in issuing securities for a railroad could not be on that railroad's board. But that provision was not actually put into effect until 1920. Okay, so you see a lot of resignations of elite financiers from railroad boards around 1913, 1914, 1915. It's in response to the sort of political criticism of financiers. It's also partly an effort to forestall a regulation on financiers on corporate boards, but it's very much incomplete. So there's still lots and lots of bankers on, elite bankers on railroads boards, including on competitors boards, in the late teens leading up to 1920. So yeah, George F. Baker, he's on all those railroads boards. He's the president of First National Bank, a very important financier and underwriter, and he stays there, right? And that's also true. So there's fewer JP Morgan partners on those firms' boards in 1918 than there were in 1908, but there's still many of them. So it's a process in which the elite financiers are pushing themselves out and also getting pushed out by the law, but it's very much incomplete in 1918 when we're seeing them there.
And if you're not a financier, what are the rules?
Oh no, so there's no prohibition on board interlocks among competitors for railroads, and those boards are all deeply interlocked with one another and via other people as well. So there's Section 7 of the Clayton Act prohibits interlocks among competitors who are manufacturers above a certain scale. That does not apply to railroads.
I also have a almost, maybe it's a naive question, but I was wondering whether railroads had a particularly bad reputation for manipulation all the way back from the days of Daniel Drew forward, and whether or not, shareholders might be worried that if they bought them, one, that those prices would be manipulated by a few large shareholders. Maybe there's some text analytics that one could do. But also, as you described the M&A activity, those kinds of acquisitions provided opportunities for overpaying and tunneling and all sorts of things. If that was unusual to the rail industry, it would make it difficult to make you worry about being a shareholder and being taken advantage of by a few large owners that are buying and selling their own companies to each other.
So thank you for that. First of all, I think you start to see the widespread presence of elite financiers on railroad boards in the 1880s, precisely in response to that first problem that you mentioned. That the reason J.P. Morgan became so influential in railroading was precisely that, he acquired the power and prestige to help control, unscrupulous insiders and the really bad manipulators like Daniel Drew and so on. And so he actually came in cases where there were bad disputes like that. So I think they justified their presence in some respect by helping to solve that first problem, like unscrupulous insiders screwing over shareholders. Now, in terms of these acquisitions and opportunities for tunneling, I think for the most part, what's being done as these railroads are consolidating with one another is to undertake measures that benefit the shareholders at the expense of consumers. So they are suppressing competition among railroads to ensure high rates and so on and stability and in a way that's harmful for consumers more so than investors. Now, having said that, this came up a little bit earlier. Some of the investments of railroads and other railroads were by dominant regional competitors in smaller ones who are in no position to try to wield control in return by investing in the dominant firm. So like the Pennsylvania Railroad acquiring 13% of the Baltimore and Ohio, which was an important competitor, but much smaller. So that's a case where I think at least the consensus from the accounts at the time is that, the Pennsylvania is suppressing the growth of that firm. And they're not necessarily tunneling resources out of it, although they might indeed have been doing some of that as well. But their main target is to prevent the Baltimore and Ohio from expanding, growing, becoming a more serious competitive threat, which it could have been, right? And so having the Pennsylvania Railroad being a large block holder in the Baltimore and Ohio was probably not good for the most part for the other shareholders in the Baltimore and Ohio.
I want to call your attention to a question which is in the Q&A that maybe you can answer before we close in about 7 minutes. And it's from Mary Yeager, who's asking about women. Have women disappeared from the economic and industrial history of the period? So Henry, go ahead.
This concerns a famous book written by Mark Rowe some 30 years ago or so, called Weak Owners, Strong Managers, or Strong Managers, Weak Owners. I don't remember what the order was. And the thesis of the book was that Americans Americans were largely unconcerned about concentrated control of industrial companies, but that they hated, or we hated, control by financiers. We got very nervous. American citizens got very nervous when financiers started controlling productive enterprise. But they're perfectly happy to have managers of those enterprises control those enterprises, even if they're responsible to nobody other than themselves. So managerialism wasn't a problem, but financial control of capitalism was a problem. Should we read your paper as complicating that story a little bit, or as consistent with it? Rather than ask you more specific versions of that paper, that question, I'll just let you answer that general fluffball question. So that's it. Is Mark Rowe right or wrong?
I would say, Mark is a little bit more focused on a slightly later period and on efforts to, restrict what institutional investors can do and so on. I think our contribution is complementary to his in a sense, because he's arguing that these political forces, nervousness about the role of financial institutions in the economy reshaped, the distribution of power in financial markets. And we're sort of pointing out something similar for an earlier period. It's not about institutional owners because they're, that wasn't really so relevant as an issue at the time. There aren't any big pensions, nothing like that. Institutions, right? But there are of course private bankers. But that antitrust efforts to restrain, in this case, large owners in the form of railroads, probably contributed to the diffusion of ownership as well. Also, the role of financiers is diminishing, at least in their presence on corporate boards in the later part of our period. And that's entirely consistent with his story. And that's a response to a backlash of that financiers have too much power over the world of business and financial markets. This cartel of this New York money trust is too influential, and efforts were undertaken to sort of split that up. So I think he would probably see his story as our story as an antecedent to his. I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and now Chris McKenna, and then maybe you can speak to Mary's question.
Sure.
Okay.
So I have a pretty simple question, which is and I think it may just be in your next, in the other article you've been alluding to, but that's about the presence of lawyers on these boards. And so it seems to me that pressed by antitrust, and to the degree that maybe the financiers were being asked to leave, I wondered whether their own lawyers were joining the boards. And so in other words, as JP Morgan left, did he say, well, I'd actually like the person who follows me to be somebody from Sherman and Sterling, right? And that strikes me that rose in the later period that Mark Rowe talked about. And it's always been fascinating to see that, because the UK, for example, didn't really bring in lawyers the same way. They tended to focus on accountants. They were always, the people in the UK tended to be surprised that the American boards were stuffed with lawyers. And of course, the answer from the Americans was antitrust and everything else means we'd better put these people on the boards. So I was wondering, as you said, I don't really know you didn't necessarily know what the composition was from that other period, other than, this movement of insiders and financiers. But I wondered if you were looking for their own lawyers.
That's a wonderful suggestion. I can't answer it completely because we don't know the identities of all the directors we're working with, right? So in some cases we do, in other cases we don't. I will say that there, among the individuals who held the largest number of directorships at this time, one often sees lawyers. So there were lawyers who were like chief counsel to a very important railroad like the New York Central that worked closely with that railroad's financiers. They would be very likely to be among those who are chosen to join the boards of competitors in those cases, along with the bankers. But I think what you're saying is it's possible, but we don't have an easy way to identify the lawyers as of yet, and so I can't quite answer the question. Give that question the full answer it deserves. So about women, I think it's an extremely interesting and important issue. It's one that takes on a political significance in the years around 1914. So as in the Wilson administration and its allies in Congress are creating the Federal Trade Commission and restricting and passing the Clayton Act and restricting the activities of financiers in other ways, business responded by pointing out that a lot of their shareholders were not only like widows and orphans, but also women, the characters in society who at the time were probably regarded as more sympathetic than people tended to imagine. And so, the idea being that, if you're gonna hurt business by imposing rigid new regulations, you're hurting all these hundreds of thousands of shareholders, and in particular, lots of women, right? So that some of the data that was produced by industry at the time actually identifies women shareholders. And our lists of the largest shareholders of railroads also include some women or people who we think are women. So we need to rigorously go through them, and all we can do is really use first names and use their names to identify their gender, and probably look them up in the census and verify who they are and so on. But we should be able to shed more light on that question with the data that we have. So this paper was put together very quickly, but this data can probably be used to shed light on that question, and we certainly hope to. Another interesting question is, do you start to see women directors on corporations that had a lot of women owners in future years as well? So we don't know the answer to that, but we're interested in exploring.